There's also our eminent panel, Brian Hioe. He's the editor of New Blue magazine, is joining us on the broadcast. We also have Mr. James M. Dorsey. He's a senior fellow at S. Rajaratnam School at International Studies at the NTU University. And also we have Mr. Sushant Sareen. He's a senior fellow at the ORF and also a strategic affairs expert. Mr. Ashok Sajnar, who's a former diplomat, is also joining us on the broadcast. And Raymond Vickery is also with us on the show, getting us all the details. I want to take in a quick word. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on the show. And Brian, coming to you first and taking in a perspective from you, as my colleague Will Ripley was pointing out from Taipei, that the situation is very, very tense, and the next few months and days are going to be very critical into what kind of action the Chinese actually take. Will this war rhetoric actually turn into a reality and into a kind of escalation that the Pacific region has not really seen?
I'd actually offer a word of caution there, because the mood is actually fairly calm in terms of the past 48 hours. There's been much more notice of the Pelosi visit, but while the world was discussing this for weeks and weeks, it was actually until then that Taiwanese seemed to realize that this was taking place. And so Taiwan has faced military drills in the past and military threats from China for literally decades. And so right now, I actually don't see too much panic. I mean, we are on day one of these drills. We don't know what will occur. There might be more escalation. And I also do think for this kind of thing, it takes time for images and video to filter through the news and social media to people. But I think we're going to have to see. And I think the jury's still out if people will actually panic. I don't see that happening at present. In terms of Chinese action, I think that jury is also still out. The ball is often in their court, and I think that's the case with this too.
All right, so you think that there's no case for a panic right now. James, I'm coming to you. Xi Jinping has responded very sharply after Nancy Pelosi's visit. The sort of aggression that the Japanese have reported is also very worrisome for that entire region. How do you see this really progressing in the next 72 hours? Because that's going to be very, very critical.
Well, I think that fundamentally neither China nor the United States wants an armed confrontation, at least not at this point. I think the problem is that what you've seen is, or let me put it differently, Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was an accident waiting to happen. In a situation in which you have increased big power rivalry and a hardening position on the part of the political elites, both in the United States and in China, as well as in terms of public opinion. The problem you're going to have going forward is that the degree of confrontation, or if you wish, of showmanship in the around Taiwan that is now being established with these Chinese exercises is something that we're probably going to see more permanently. For example, these kind of exercises not being a one-off event, but potentially an annual event. The other thing, of course, is that the economic sanctions that my colleague mentioned that the Chinese are already imposing, those are sanctions that are going to last much longer than the next 72 hours. So the question is going to be managing increased tension and increased showmanship up until the point where presumably the Chinese would want to make their claim of Taiwan being part of China a realistic thing, rather than right now a notional claim.
All right. I think that's also in line with what Will was also pointing out. And he was saying that the next 12 to 24 months are going to be very critical, keeping in mind that does China make this a more aggressive exercise to actually start a conflict that we have not seen earlier. So, Shant, I'm coming to you. 2 points that James mentioned. This was an accident waiting to happen, and we're talking about the visit of Nancy Pelosi. And some kind of permanent annual event where the Chinese military or their maritime might is at display, threatening Taiwan, looking at an eventual takeover of the country. Is that a possibility you consider?
Well, that's a possibility you cannot ignore. I think that's a very real possibility, but have the Chinese factored in and gamed all the consequences of such a move? Because clearly there will be consequences, and not just military. There'll be economic and political and diplomatic consequences. A lot of it, of course, will depend upon how much the Taiwanese are willing to stand up for their independence, and how much the rest of the world is willing to put its money where its mouth is. So a lot of it will depend upon that. The other part of it is, look, I don't necessarily agree with the thing that Pelosi's visit was an accident waiting to happen. I think the tensions have been mounting for a fair bit of time. And my own sense is that it was important for the Americans to show that they are not going to be a pushover for the kind of aggressive moves that the Chinese have been making. For example, before the Ukraine war started, the Chinese were trying to intimidate the Taiwanese by constantly, sending their aircraft over, constantly, pressing other pressure points of the Taiwanese. And now, of course, that whole situation has got escalated to a very dangerous level. But will the Chinese want to push the envelope further and actually risk an all-out confrontation at this point in time with all the economic consequences, which even if the rest of the world was to, behave like they behaved in Afghanistan, pretend that the place does not exist and move on, can the Chinese, afford that kind of a confrontation even with Taiwan, with all the disruptions it begins? Look, the disruptions, economic disruptions are not just going to affect Taiwan. They're also going to affect China.
Okay.
And yes, so it kind of works both ways. But yes, we are not in a very comfortable position. And this pressure is only going to stay and going to increase going forward, unless somebody, is able to make the Chinese back off. And I don't know if anybody is ready to do that just yet.
Mr. Ashok Sajanar, I'm coming to you. When the visit of Nancy Pelosi was being talked about, there was